The great city of Thebes basked under the golden light of Ra as priests and nobles gathered inside the grand temple of Amun-Ra. High priest Menkor stood before the sacred flame, his face stern with the weight of destiny. His daughter, Isikara, draped in pristine white linen, knelt before the altar, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering fire. She was not just the daughter of the temple's most powerful priest. She was chosen by the gods, destined to marry Pharaoh and rule beside him. But as the sacred chants filled the temple halls, an old oracle woman limped inside, her frail body trembling with urgency. The priests gasped at her intrusion, but before anyone could stop her, she spoke in a raspy voice. "The daughter of the high priest will forsake her throne for a love written in darkness." A hush fell over the temple. Isikara's heart pounded as she turned to her father, but Menkaur's face was cold. "Take her away," he ordered, dismissing the prophecy as nonsense. Yet, in the depths of his heart, fear coiled like a serpent. He knew that the gods never spoke in vain. Isikara, unaware of what fate had planned, tried to dismiss the words. She had been raised to be obedient, her future preordained. Yet, somewhere deep inside, a yearning stirred, longing for something beyond duty and destiny. That night, as the full moon cast an ethereal glow upon the temple walls, a figure emerged from the shadows. Cloaked in darkness, his golden eyes gleamed with an unnatural light. He watched her from afar, unseen yet ever present. He was not of this world, he was cursed, and soon Isikara would have to make an impossible choice. Isikara tossed in her lavish bed, unable to sleep. The words of the oracle echoed in her mind, an eerie whisper that refused to fade. A love written in darkness. She had never known love, only duty. The idea of forsaking her destiny for something so reckless was unthinkable. Yet, beneath the layers of responsibility, curiosity flickered like a flame. Who could tempt her away from a throne? Outside the temple, a lone figure watched from the shadows. He had been watching for many nights, drawn by something even he could not explain. Wrapped in a dark cloak, his golden eyes shimmered in the moonlight, an unnatural glow that marked his curse. His name was Asar, a warrior once favored by the gods until he defied them. Now he was bound to an immortal fate, cursed to walk the land as an outcast, untouched by time but tormented by longing. He had wandered the sands of Egypt for centuries. Yet when he saw Isikara, something shifted within him. He had seen beauty before, but hers was different. It was not just her face, but the fire in her eyes, the silent longing buried beneath her poise. Isikara stood by her balcony, the cool night breeze brushing against her skin. A strange sensation gripped her, like unseen eyes tracing her every move. She scanned the temple grounds, her pulse quickening. And then she saw him, a shadow among shadows. But those eyes, they glowed like embers in the night, their gazes locked for a brief moment before he vanished into the darkness. A shiver ran down her spine. She should have been afraid. Instead, she felt something else entirely, an unfamiliar thrill. The following days passed in restless anticipation. Isikara tried to silence the thoughts invading her mind, but the image of the man with the golden eyes lingered. Who was he? Why had his presence unsettled her, yet awakened something deep inside? She knew better than to dwell on such forbidden thoughts. As the daughter of the high priest, she was bound to the gods' will. But the gods had remained silent, offering no answer, only a gnawing sense of inevitability. One evening, Isikara walked alone through the temple gardens, seeking solace among the sacred lotus ponds. The priests were deep in their evening prayers, and the air was thick with the scent of burning incense. The world was quiet, save for the whisper of the wind through the papyrus reeds. Then, a presence, a shadow shifting among the trees. Her pulse quickened as she turned sharply. "Who's there?" she called, though she was unsure if she truly wanted to know. From the darkness, he stepped forward tall, cloaked, his face partially hidden beneath his hood. But the moment she saw his eyes, she knew. "You should not be here," she said, though her voice betrayed no fear. "And yet, here I am," he replied, his voice deep, laced with something ancient, something sorrowful. A silence stretched between them, charged and unspoken. She should call the guards. She should run. But she did neither. Instead, she took a step closer, drawn by something beyond reason. "Who are you?" she whispered. A pause. Then, with the weight of eternity in his voice, he answered, "A man cursed to love what he can never have." Isikara felt the weight of his words settle in the space between them. A man cursed to love what he could never have. The sorrow in his voice sent a shiver through her, yet it only fueled her curiosity. "A curse?" she echoed, her eyes searching his shadowed face. "What do you mean?" Asar hesitated. He had spent centuries hiding his truth, wandering through time as an outcast. But something about her presence, her fire unraveled the walls he had built around himself. "Long ago, I was a warrior of Pharaoh's guard," he said, "favored by the gods, blessed with strength beyond men. But I was arrogant. I thought I could control fate itself." Isikara listened, captivated. He spoke of a time when he was once revered, when his name was spoken in awe across the kingdom. But pride had been his downfall. "I loved a woman," Asar continued, his voice laced with an old pain. "She was promised to the gods, much like you. But I defied destiny. I stole her away, believing love was stronger than fate." He exhaled, the memory still raw despite the centuries. "The gods were not merciful. They struck her down before my eyes, and as punishment, they cursed me with eternal life and never to age, never to love, only to wander the sands alone." Isikara's breath caught. The weight of his suffering pressed against her chest. She had been raised to fear the wrath of the gods, but hearing his story, she felt something she shouldn't: sympathy, even defiance. "And now," she whispered, "why are you here?" Asar's golden eyes burned into hers. "Because I saw you, and for the first time in centuries, I felt something again." Isikara's heart pounded at Asar's words. No man had ever spoken to her this way, with such raw intensity. She should have recoiled, should have reminded herself that she was promised to Pharaoh, bound by divine law. Yet she could not look away. "You should not say such things," she murmured, though the conviction in her voice wavered. Asar took a slow step closer, his presence overwhelming. "And yet, I do." His voice was steady, laced with an emotion she could not name. "You are bound to a life that is not your own, Isikara. I know that prison well." She swallowed, torn between reason and the strange pull she felt toward him. He was an outcast, a man cursed by the gods themselves. To even be seen speaking to him could cost her everything. And yet, she had never felt more awake than in this moment. I should leave, she said, though she made no move to go. But you won't, Asar replied. His words were not a command, only a truth she could not deny. The night air grew thick with silence, charged with something forbidden. She thought of her father, of the prophecy, of the throne she was destined to claim. And yet, as she stood before Asar, none of it seemed to matter. "What happens if I stay?" she asked, before she could stop herself. Asar's lips curled into something almost like sorrow. "Then you risk everything." Isikara took a deep breath, knowing she stood at the edge of something irreversible. "Then tell me," she said, her voice steady. "What does it mean to love a man who cannot die?" Asar looked at her for a long moment before answering. "It means losing yourself to a fate even crueler than mine." Isikara spent the next days in turmoil, her mind a battlefield between duty and desire. The golden eyes of the cursed warrior haunted her thoughts, his voice a whisper in her soul. She knew what was expected of her: to serve the gods, to marry Pharaoh, to rule as queen. But what was she without choice? Without freedom? The temple halls grew suffocating. She longed for the night, for the hidden corners of the garden where Asar waited. Each meeting was stolen time, word exchanged a step further into the abyss. She knew it was dangerous, that if anyone discovered them, her father's wrath would be merciless. But she could not stop. One evening, she found Asar waiting beneath the sacred fig tree. "You are reckless," he told her as she approached. "You risk too much." Isikara's breath was uneven. "Then tell me to leave." His silence was her answer. He could not. They were both bound, not by gods, but by something far more dangerous choice. But the gods were not blind, nor were the priests. Isikara had not noticed the eyes watching her, the whispers growing in the shadows. Her father, High Priest Menkor, stood in the temple's inner sanctum, his hands clenched as one of the younger priests bowed before him. "She meets him in the garden," the boy whispered. "A man who should not exist." A terrible silence filled the chamber. The high priest turned his gaze to the statue of Amun-Ra. The gods had spoken. His daughter was on the path of ruin. "Summon the guards," he ordered coldly. "Bring her to me, and if she resists, destroy him." Isikara was unaware of the storm brewing around her. The night air was thick with the scent of lotus and the hum of distant prayers. As she stood beneath the fig tree with Asar, she allowed herself to forget for just a moment who she was, what she was meant to be. "I wish we had met in another life," she whispered. Asar's golden eyes held a sorrow she could not fathom. "In another life, I would not have been cursed," he murmured, "and you would not have been bound to a throne you never wanted." But fate had no mercy. The rustling of leaves was the only warning before torches illuminated the darkness. Isikara turned sharply, her heart lurching as temple guards stormed toward them. "Isikara, run!" Asar growled, but before she could move, strong hands seized her arms. A voice, sharp as a blade, cut through the chaos. "Do not resist, daughter." Her blood turned to ice. High Priest Menkor stood beyond the flames, his expression void of warmth. "You have betrayed the gods," his voice laced with controlled fury. "You have disgraced this temple." Isikara struggled, but the guards held her firm. "No, father." Silence. His gaze shifted to Asar, eyes burning with hatred. "And you are a defilement to the gods." He turned to the guards. "Kill him." "No," Isikara screamed as the first sword slashed through the air, but Asar did not fall. The blade struck him and shattered. The guards gasped in horror. Asar's eyes darkened, the ancient curse pulsing through his veins. The gods had bound him to suffer, but they had never made him weak. The temple guards froze in horror as the shattered blade clattered to the ground. Asar stood unmoved, his golden eyes now burning with an eerie, otherworldly glow. The curse that bound him for centuries stirred violently within him, awakened by the threat of death, a punishment the gods had denied him. Isikara's breath hitched. She had always sensed something unnatural about him, but now she saw it with her own eyes. Asar was no ordinary man. He was something beyond time, beyond mortality. The high priest, however, did not waver. "You defy the gods and think yourself invincible?" Menkor spat, his voice filled with righteous fury. "You are an abomination. Your soul is damned." The guards hesitated, unsure whether to attack again. But Asar stepped forward, his voice cold as the desert night. "The gods took everything from me," he said, "and yet they curse me to walk this earth, never to find peace. If that is their justice, then I reject it." The very air around them seemed to shift, thick with unseen energy. The ground trembled slightly beneath their feet. The guards gripped their weapons, but fear kept them rooted. This was not a man they could kill. Isikara fought against the hands that held her. "Stop this," she pleaded, her voice desperate. "Father, please. You have brought disgrace upon this temple." Menkor's voice was raw with rage. "You are no longer my daughter." The words struck harder than any blade. Isikara's vision blurred with tears as Asar turned to her. "Come with me," he said, his voice soft amid the chaos. "Leave this behind." Her heart pounded. The path of duty lay behind her. The path of the unknown stretched before her. She had only seconds to choose. Isikara's entire world hung in the balance. The torches burned bright, casting flickering shadows on the temple walls, but nothing could obscure the rage in her father's eyes or the silent plea in Asar's. The moment stretched, unbearably heavy, as she stood at the crossroads between duty and the unknown. Her breath came in short gasps. If she chose Asar, she would become an exile, hunted for betraying the gods. If she stayed, she would be forced into a life she no longer wanted, bound to a pharaoh she did not love. But one truth burned brighter than all others. She had never felt more alive than when she was with Asar. "I will not go back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then, louder, stronger, she turned to her father. "I will not be a pawn to the gods." A collective gasp rippled through the temple guards. High Priest Menkar's face darkened with fury. "You defy the will of Amun-Ra?" he roared. "You condemn yourself to eternal damnation." Isikara lifted her chin, her heart pounding against her ribs. "No, father. I choose love over a throne built on chains." Before the guards could react, Asar grabbed her hand. A surge of power pulsed through him, the air thick with unseen forces. The torches flickered wildly as the curse within him stirred, wrapping around them like an unseen storm. "Run," he whispered. They bolted through the temple grounds, past the shrieks of priests and the shouts of guards. Behind them, Menkora's voice roared like thunder. "You will never escape the wrath of the gods, Isikara. "You will suffer for this betrayal." But she did not look back. For the first time in her life, she was free. Isikara and Asar ran through the temple grounds, their hearts pounding in unison as the cries of priests and the clamor of armed guards faded behind them. The cold desert air wrapped around them, but the fire in Isikara's chest burned hotter. She had chosen love over duty, defied the gods, and cast away the throne that was meant to be hers. But the gods do not forgive so easily. As they reached the edge of the city, a terrible silence fell. The wind stopped. The stars above flickered unnaturally, as if the heavens themselves had drawn breath. Then, a deafening crack split the sky. A force beyond human comprehension rippled through the air, knocking Isikara to her knees. Asar stood before her, his body rigid, his eyes glowing like molten gold. "No," he whispered, "they've come." A shadow darker than the night stretched across the desert sand. Figures emerged from the emptiness, ethereal beings, cloaked in shifting smoke, their eyes burning with divine wrath. The gods had sent their judgment. Isikara gritted her teeth, reaching for Asar's hand, but he did not move. His face twisted in pain, his curse thrashing inside him. The gods would not kill him. They could not, but they could take away what he loved. "Isikara!" Asar roared, but it was too late. An unseen force wrenched her from the ground. Cold fire burned through her veins as the god's fury consumed her. She screamed, reaching for Asar, but her vision blurred, the world fracturing into shadows and light. And then silence. When Asar opened his eyes, the desert was empty. Isikara was gone. The gods had taken their price, and Asar was cursed to wander alone once more.